The rain over Willamette Valley in early March of 2024 was not the kind that makes headlines. It did not flood roads or knock out power lines or send news crews scrambling to the riverbanks with their cameras. It was the other kind, the kind that simply refused to stop. 6 days of it, steady and gray, pressing down on the valley like a hand that had forgotten to lift. It soaked fence posts to their cores. It turned the gravel on the farm road into something closer to paste. It found every gap in every barn door, every crack seal on every equipment, shed window, every low spot in every vineyard row, and it stayed there patient and indifferent the way Oregon rain always is in March. Ray Calloway had been watching it since Tuesday. He stood at the kitchen window at 5:20 in the morning with a mug of coffee going cold between his palms, looking out at the lower block of the vineyard, the way a man looks at something he has already diagnosed but not yet treated. The vines were just waking up. Tiny pale green shoots had pushed through the buds over the past week, soft as new skin, the kind of growth that took months of winter dormancy to produce and could be undone in 2 days by the wrong conditions. The grass between the rows had gone dark and slick. The soil was soft in the way that made Ray's knees ache just thinking about walking it. He had farmed this land for 40 years. Not 40 years of talking about farming, not 40 years of reading about it, or consulting on it, or attending workshops with laminated name badges. 40 years of actual ground, actual seasons, actual losses that didn't show up anywhere except in the lines around his eyes and in the way he walked slightly slower after a bad frost than he did before it. He had kept this place alive through a freeze in 1991 that killed half the Pinot Noir block on the South Hill. Through the market collapse in 2008, when the price per ton of Willamette Valley grapes dropped so far that 3 neighboring farms sold out within 18 months. Through a fungal outbreak in 2016 that cost him more in emergency treatment than he spent on the entire operation in some of his early years. He had kept it alive because he had learned through those specific disasters what worked, not what should work, not what made sense in theory, what actually worked on this actual soil in this actual valley when the actual problems showed up. What worked was watching for trouble early, identifying it correctly, and applying the right product in the right amount at the right time. It was not complicated. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of farming anyone made documentaries about. But it was the reason there were still grapes on this land. The snails had started moving. He could see them from the window if he looked at the lower trellis line in the early light. Small shapes on the wet wood. Not a catastrophe yet, not something that would make the evening news. But Ray had been doing this long enough to know what the first morning of snail movement looked like and what it became by the end of the week if you let it run. The young shoots were exactly what they wanted. Soft, bright, high in water content, easy to chew through before the tissue hardened. By Thursday, if the rain held and the temperature stayed above 40 degrees, the damage in the lower block could be significant. He had seen it before. He knew the number to call. He had not called it yet. He was waiting in the way that farmers who have seen too many false alarms learn to wait for the morning to tell him something definitive. The coffee cooled further. The rain continued. The light over the valley came up slow and flat, the way it does when there is no sun behind it, just a slightly less dark version of the night. Ray Calloway was 63 years old. He had a bad right knee, a mostly good back, a 38-year marriage, and a daughter who had come home 4 months ago with a college degree and a folder full of ideas. He had not yet decided which of those 4 things was giving him the most trouble. Claire had arrived in November, a year after finishing her degree at Oregon State, having spent that year doing what she called field research on sustainable farming operations across the Pacific Northwest. What Ray called it was traveling on borrowed time before reality showed up. He had not said that to her face. He had said it to Donna, who had given him the look she reserved for opinions he was allowed to have, but not allowed to repeat, and he had let it go. The truth was that Claire coming home had not been a problem in November. In November, the vines were dormant. The equipment was in the shed, and the conversations at the dinner table had been easy, the way they always are when there is no work to disagree about. She had sat with him in the evenings and asked about the harvest numbers, and listened when he talked, which was more than most people did, and Ray had thought cautiously that maybe this was going to work out fine. Then February came and she set a blue folder on the kitchen table. He remembered the exact moment. Donna was at the counter sorting through a stack of receipts that had been accumulating since January. Ray was on his second cup of coffee going through the seed supplier catalog, even though he already knew what he was ordering. The folder landed on the table between them with a soft thump, and Claire sat down across from him with the careful, controlled expression of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say. She wanted to bring ducks into the vineyard. Ray had looked up slowly. He had made sure his face did not do anything dramatic. He had long since learned that the first reaction was the one people remembered, and that if you were a father, your first reaction to your grown child's idea carried more weight than you intended it to. Ducks, he said. Claire walked him through it. Runner ducks, she explained, and possibly some khaki Campbells for variety. Good foragers, low impact on root systems compared to chickens or pigs capable of moving under trellis lines without damaging bark. They ate snails, slugs, soft-bodied larvae, the kind of pests that went for new growth in wet spring conditions. They were not a replacement for every tool in the shed. They were what she called a living layer of prevention, something that reduced pest pressure before the pressure became a crisis rather than responding to the crisis after it had already started. The setup cost would be approximately $1,900. Ducklings' temporary fencing water tubs feed and a used mobile shelter that she had already found listed in Corvallis. Ray had looked at the folder. He had looked at Claire. Then he had looked back at the folder because looking at it was easier than managing whatever his face was doing at that particular moment. "We grow grapes," he finally said, "not a petting zoo." Claire did not argue. She said she knew that. She said she was not talking about pets. She left the folder on the table and went to help Donna with the receipts, and Ray sat there with his catalog and his coffee and did not turn a single page for the next 11 minutes. He told her he would think about it. He thought about it for 11 days. What he told Donna on the third night when she found him sitting in the equipment shed at 9 in the evening with the folder open on the workbench and the overhead light on was that he had been going over the numbers. She did not say anything to that. She leaned against the door frame and looked at him with the patience of someone who had spent 38 years learning when to wait and when to speak. "She might be right," Ray said. He did not look up from the folder. "About the pest pressure, about the cycle, about the fact that we've been spending more on treatment every March for the past 6 years. A pause. "The slug bait isn't working the way it used to. You spray it, you knock the numbers down, and by the following week the pressure's back because the conditions that caused it haven't changed." Another pause longer. "She's not wrong about the logic." Donna waited. "If she's right," Ray said, and here his voice changed in a way that was small, but Donna heard it clearly. "Then what does that say about every spring I've been spraying this place since 1984? Donna crossed the shed slowly and sat down on the edge of the old wooden stool that had been there since Ray's father's time. She looked at her husband for a moment before she spoke. "Ray, being wrong about one method doesn't mean you were wrong about everything. It means I had options I didn't take. You had an option that wasn't proven yet. It's not proven now either," he said. "It's a folder." "Then let her prove it," Donna said. "Or don't, but be honest about why." Ray closed the folder. He turned off the overhead light and walked back to the house, and Donna followed him, and neither of them said anything else about it that night. But the folder stayed on the workbench. He had put it there deliberately. He went back to it the following morning before Claire was awake, standing in the equipment shed in the dark, with a flashlight angled at the pages reading the data she had compiled from 3 Oregon vineyards that had used waterfowl in integrated pest management programs over the previous 5 years. The numbers were not overwhelming. They were not the kind of numbers that made the decision obvious. But they were consistent. Across 3 different operations across 5 seasons, with different rainfall patterns, the blocks with managed waterfowl rotation showed lower spring pest pressure and reduced emergency spray use compared to the control blocks on the same farms. It was not a published study. It was not peer-reviewed. It was a senior project printed on cheap paper by a 27-year-old who had done her homework. Ray read it twice. He set the flashlight down. He stood in the dark for a while. On the 11th day, he walked into the equipment shed where Claire was cleaning pruning shears over a drain bucket, and he told her if she tried this, the ducks stayed out of the fruit. She said they would stay out of the fruit. He told her if they turned the lower block into a mud hole, they were done. She said that was fair. He told her he was not naming them. She smiled without looking up from the shears. There were things Ray did not tell her. There were things he had not told anyone in a long time stored away in the careful way that men of his generation stored the things that felt too specific to explain without sounding like complaints. He had been 25 years old once. He had stood in the same valley with ideas of his own, a folder of his own, not a blue one but a manila one with a rubber band around it, and he had sat across from his father, Earl Calloway, at this same kitchen table. Earl had been 61 that year, and Earl had run this vineyard with the same certainty. Ray now carried the certainty of a man who had learned through hard experience what worked and what didn't, who had paid for that knowledge in the currency of bad seasons and would not risk what he had built on something unproven. Ray's idea in 1986 had been a modified irrigation rotation, a cycle-based system that alternated moisture delivery between rows in a pattern that, according to the agricultural literature he had been reading, could reduce the microclimate conditions that favored fungal development in the vine canopy. He had spent 3 months working it out. He had built a cost model. He had written it up in 12 pages. Earl had read 4 of them. Then he had set the folder down and said with the kind of finality that did not invite debate that the irrigation system worked fine, that they were not spending money on modifications that hadn't been tested in this valley, and that Ray was welcome to read as many books as he liked as long as the actual work got done. Ray had written something in the folder that night on the last blank page more for himself than for anyone. He had written, "Sometimes the right idea just needs the right person at the right time." Then he had put the rubber band back around the folder and put it in a box and put the box in the storage corner of the old packing shed, which the family still called by that name, even though it hadn't been used for packing since the late 70s. He had not thought about that folder in years. But standing in the equipment shed on the 11th day watching Claire wipe down the pruning shears with the careful, methodical attention of someone who had been taught to respect the tools, he thought about it now. He had become his father. He had not noticed it happening. It had not been a decision. It had been an accumulation of seasons, each one teaching him something specific about what worked on this land. Each lesson arriving through failure rather than theory, until he had developed a framework for farming that was so rooted in his own experience that anything outside it registered as risk rather than possibility. He had become the man who knew what worked, the man who had paid for that knowledge, the man who did not change things that weren't broken. Earl Calloway had been that man too. Ray did not say any of this to Claire. He told her the duck thing would probably be a mess and that he expected her to clean up after it, and he walked back to the house and Claire went back to the pruning shears. The ducklings arrived in the last week of February. Claire had ordered them from a hatchery in the valley and picked them up herself in the farm truck, returning with 2 cardboard boxes that she carried into the old packing shed with the same focused expression she had used presenting the folder. Ray watched from the doorway as she set up the brooder, a wire enclosure under 2 heat lamps that she had assembled over the previous weekend, with the temperature gauge positioned at eye level and the water tray designed to be changed twice daily. The ducklings were small in the way that makes the word small feel inadequate. They were essentially noise with feet. They came out of the boxes in a stream of yellow-brown fuzz and immediately began investigating every surface of the brooder with the urgent, unfocused energy of creatures who had just discovered the world and found it both alarming and deeply interesting. Ray stood in the doorway for roughly 45 seconds. Then he went to fix a belt on the irrigation pump that had been bothering him since January. Over the following week, he developed what he would have described as a policy of organized disinterest. He walked past the packing shed on his way to other things. He noted as he passed that the ducklings were alive and apparently growing, which he assumed was the relevant metric. He registered without comment that Claire was awake before him every morning to check the temperature in the brooder and change the water because ducks, as he had now learned without wanting to, are remarkably efficient at converting clean water into something resembling warm soup. On the 4th morning, he stopped at the shed door on his way to the tractor and looked in. The ducklings had grown noticeably in 4 days. They were still small, but they had developed the slightly unhinged proportions of adolescents' feet and bills that seemed to belong to a larger animal, fuzzy bodies that had not yet received the memo. "They smell," Ray said. Claire was changing the water tray without looking up. "So does compost." "Compost doesn't scream at 4 in the morning." Claire set the clean tray back in place. They settled down after the first week. Ray noticed at this point that the latch on the brooder door was not quite closing correctly. It was a small thing, a slight misalignment that meant the door didn't seat properly and could in the wrong circumstances allow a gap large enough for a curious duckling to push through. He pulled a screwdriver from his jacket pocket, which he kept there out of habit, and adjusted the mounting plate on the latch until it seated correctly. Claire looked up when she heard the screwing. He put the screwdriver back in his pocket and walked to the tractor without saying anything about it. 3 days after that, he noticed one of the smallest ducklings, a compact, slightly frantic creature that seemed to arrive at the feed tray slightly after the others every time, was having difficulty reaching the water because the tray was positioned at a height calibrated for the larger birds. Ray found a shallow ceramic dish in the equipment shed, the kind used for catching drip from oil changes, rinsed it twice, filled it with water, and placed it at a lower level near the corner of the brooder where the small one tended to congregate. He did not mention this to Claire. Claire did not mention it to him, but he saw her notice it the following morning when she came in for the first check. She stood still for a moment looking at the dish, then went about her work. Ray drove to Burl Hennessy's farm supply store that Thursday for chain links he needed for the fence repair on the north property line. Burl's was the kind of store that had been on that road for long enough that people thought of it as permanent, the way they thought of the post office or the grain elevator, an institution maintained less by profit than by the fact that its absence was unthinkable. Burl himself was 55 and had the measured, observational quality of a man whose job required him to understand what farmers actually needed, as opposed to what they said they needed, and who had developed strong opinions over the years about the difference. 2 vineyard owners Ray recognized were at the coffee station when he came in. Marv Elstrom from the operation 3 miles north, and a younger man named Dale Pruitt, who had taken over his uncle's property 2 seasons ago and was still in Ray's assessment, figuring out what he didn't know yet. Ray was examining a display of fence clips when he heard Claire's voice. He had not known she was there. She was at the counter, a roll of temporary netting over one shoulder, talking to Burl about something she called a duck lane. Burl's expression was the particular expression of a man who has decided not to be rude, but has already concluded the conversation is not serious. He was nodding with slightly too much patience. Marv Elstrom turned from the coffee station with genuine curiosity, the kind that precedes a laugh. Dale Pruitt was already smiling. Claire explained. Runner ducks pest control, early season deployment, before fruit set rotational fencing to manage their movement through the rows. She was calm and specific. She had clearly explained this before and was prepared for the response she was about to receive. Burl's expression did not change. Ducks aren't a pest management plan, he said with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering a verdict they consider self-evident. Marv Elstrom laughed, not meanly, but fully, the laugh of a man who found the image genuinely funny. There'll be pest management until the coyotes manage the ducks. Dale Pruitt added something about rows turning into ponds. Then Burl said something he probably did not realize was anything more than a casual observation delivered in the tone people use for things they consider settled. Your grandfather Earl ran this valley the right way, product and problem out, kept it simple. Ray, 3 feet away behind a display rack, went very still. Burl meant it as a compliment to Earl. He almost certainly meant it as a friendly reference point, a piece of local history, something that connected Claire to the land's past. He had no way of knowing what the name Earl Calloway meant, inside the specific architecture of Ray's memory, what room it opened, what it contained, what it felt like to stand in that room unexpectedly on a Thursday morning in a farm supply store, while your daughter stood at the counter not reacting to a sentence that had just rearranged something in your chest. Claire paid for her items. She thanked Burl. She nodded to Marv Elstrom without any indication that the exchange had bothered her, picked up her roll of netting, and walked out. Ray bought his chain links. He drove home separately because they had taken separate trucks. He sat in the driveway for a minute before going inside. He had been 25 when Earl said no. He had put the folder in a box. He had kept farming the way Earl had taught him because the way Earl had taught him worked, and because working was what you did when the thing you wanted to try had been ruled out. Over the decades, he had stopped thinking of it as a compromise. It had simply become how he farmed. The methods became experience. The experience became certainty. The certainty became eventually the same voice that had stopped him calm, authoritative, grounded in things that had actually been tested. Product and problem out. Keep it simple. That was Earl. That was also Ray. The distance between them, which had felt significant when Ray was 25, had collapsed somewhere between the bad frost of 1991 and the market crisis of 2008 in the accumulation of seasons where the old methods had kept the farm alive when new ideas had not yet been tested against anything that mattered. The problem was that Claire's idea was being tested against something that mattered. The problem was that the folder on the workbench had numbers in it that Ray had read twice in the dark with a flashlight. The problem was that when Burl Hennessy said your grandfather Earl ran this valley the right way, Ray heard it the way a man hears a sentence that is also a mirror. And what he saw in that mirror was not entirely comfortable. He went inside. He did not say any of this to Claire. He did not say it to Donna. He made dinner and ate it and went to bed, and the rain resumed sometime after midnight. By the third week of February, Claire had begun training the ducks in the yard behind the barn. They were no longer ducklings in any meaningful sense. They had entered the adolescent phase that Ray privately thought of as the awkward stage, all growing necks and oversized bills, and the total unearned confidence of creatures who had decided the world existed for them specifically to investigate. Claire ran them through a simple routine every morning: open the gate, shake a white plastic feed bucket, walk the route, return to the shelter. She had set up a series of orange traffic cones in the yard to approximate the spacing of the vine rows, and she walked them through the gaps between the cones twice a day, using the bucket as the signal. Her voice calm and consistent, never raising it when a duck went the wrong direction, which happened frequently. Ray watched from the equipment shed door without making it obvious that he was watching. The first 3 days were by any objective standard a disaster. The ducks had opinions about the route that differed from Claire's. A significant portion of them preferred the mud puddle near the barn's south corner to anything the orange cones had to offer. 2 of them developed a specific fixation with the reflective strip on an old fence post and could not be reliably routed past it. One duck, a larger bird with a distinctive brown cap marking that Claire had started calling Captain in her notes but not yet out loud, seemed to have designated itself a scout and ranged ahead of the group to investigate wherever it chose, periodically circling back to confirm that the others were in its assessment doing things wrong. Ray watched all of this. On the 4th day, something changed. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes a good story, but in the way that actual things change, which is incrementally and almost invisibly. The ducks moved through the first 2 cone gaps without splitting. They followed the bucket through the 3rd gap and the 4th. They still lost cohesion at the turn, and 3 of them went left when the route went right, but they found their way back within a minute rather than 5. By the end of the 2nd week, they moved through the entire yard route in something that could be described generously as organized. Not perfect, not like a demonstration, but well enough. Ray came out of the equipment shed on the last day of February and stood in the yard watching the morning run. Claire walked the route ahead of them, the white bucket swinging 80 ducks moving in a loose mass between the cones. Captain ranged ahead as usual, but was now looping back at roughly the correct moments. The 3 perennial stragglers in the back were stragglers, but were at least moving in the right direction. He did not say anything. He went back into the equipment shed. But that evening at dinner, for the first time since the blue folder had appeared on the table, he asked a specific question. Not about whether the ducks would work. Not about the cost. He asked how long the morning training run was taking. Claire looked at him for a beat, measuring the question, then told him about 40 minutes end-to-end, including setup and return. He nodded and went back to his food. Donna across the table did not say anything, but Ray noticed that she had set her fork down and was looking at him with an expression he recognized, the one she wore when something had shifted that she had been waiting a long time to see shift. He picked up the salt shaker, so he had something to do with his hand. 2 days into March, the rains came back harder. Ray stood at the kitchen window with his cold coffee and watched the lower block in the early gray light. The snails were moving on the trellis lines. The new shoots were soft. The conditions were exactly what he had spent 40 years learning to read, and what they were telling him was that the window for intervention was opening and would not stay open long. He thought about calling the spray crew. He had the number memorized. He could have it on the tractor by Friday, the whole lower block treated before the weekend, the problem managed the way he had managed it for 4 decades. He stood at the window for a long time. The ducks were in the packing shed. He could hear them from here on quiet mornings, a low, persistent murmur that had become over the past 3 weeks something close to familiar. Captain's voice was distinguishable from the others, slightly louder, slightly more emphatic with the particular tone of a creature who had concluded that whatever was happening was probably someone else's fault. Ray put his coffee mug in the sink. He pulled on his jacket. He did not call the spray crew. He walked to the packing shed instead, and he stood in the doorway and looked at 80 ducks who looked back at him with the complete, untroubled attention of animals who have no particular feelings about being observed. And he stood there for longer than made any practical sense. And he thought about a folder he had written in 1986 and put in a box, and a folder his daughter had written and put on his kitchen table. And the distance between those two things, and what it might mean that he was standing in a doorway at 5:30 in the morning, making a decision that felt like it was about ducks, but was actually, if he was being honest with himself, about something else entirely. The rain came down over the valley. The snails moved on the wet wood of the trellis lines. Somewhere in the lower block, the young shoots bent slightly under the weight of the water, pale and soft and new. Ray Calloway made a decision. He went to find his daughter. Claire had the fencing laid out across the barn floor by the time Ray found her that morning, panels numbered with masking tape, a hand-drawn grid of the lower block pinned to the wall beside the door. The mobile shelter already hitched to the small utility tractor she had requisitioned without asking. She had been planning the deployment for weeks. She had been waiting for him to come to her rather than going back to him because she understood, with the particular patience of someone who had grown up in this house, that Ray Calloway did not respond well to being pushed. He responded to arriving at conclusions himself. The job was to make sure the right information was available when he got there. Ray stood in the doorway and looked at the grid on the wall. 2 acres lower block sectioned into 4 rotating lanes with water station positions marked in red. The shelter path drawn in blue. Entry point, exit point, the irrigation lines mapped so the ducks could move around rather than through them. He studied it for a long moment. Then, "When do you want to start?" Claire looked up from the fencing layout. Whatever she had prepared to say in the event he agreed dissolved. "Monday," she said, "if the rain holds under an inch per hour." Ray looked out the barn door at the sky. "It'll hold." He walked back to the house to get his second cup of coffee, and Claire turned back to the fencing, and neither of them made anything of it, which was the right choice because making something of it would have changed what it was. Monday arrived with a particular quality of early March mornings in the valley cold, in a way that had more texture than temperature, a wet cold that settled into clothing and stayed there. The sky, the color of old concrete, the light arriving reluctantly as though it had not yet committed to the day. Claire was up at 5. She had the water tubs filled, the shelter positioned at the eastern edge of the lower block. The fencing run along the first lane before the sun, to the extent that anything could be called sun, had fully cleared the ridge. Ray came out at 6 with coffee and a thermos and stood at the edge of the lane without comment. He was wearing the heavy Carhartt jacket he put on when he expected to be outside for hours rather than minutes. Claire registered this. She opened the packing shed at 6:15. The ducks came out as they always did, with the urgent, uncoordinated energy of creatures who treated every morning as an emergency that only their immediate movement could resolve. She shook the white bucket. They oriented. She walked the lane. Most of them followed. Most of them. 11 ducks went left at the first bend, directly into a coil of irrigation line that Claire had somehow missed in her mapping. 3 of them went right at the second post and ended up against the temporary fencing at the field edge, where they stood and regarded the wire with the focused attention of animals who were certain the wire was the problem. Captain predictably ranged 30 feet ahead of the group, found a low spot in the soil near the trellis base, and began working it with the methodical intensity of a creature who had decided this specific location was the most important place on the farm. Ray watched from the tractor path. He had his hands in his jacket pockets. His expression was the expression of a man practicing self-control. Claire spent 20 minutes redirecting. She moved the irrigation coil. She walked the 3 fence-lined ducks back to the lane with the bucket held low. She let Captain's discovery run its course, because Captain, she had learned, could not be hurried, only waited out. By 7:30, the group was moving through the first lane with reasonable coherence. By 9, they had worked through to the third post row. By noon, Claire had counted the sample zones she had marked the previous week, small flagged areas where she had done pre-deployment snail counts on Saturday. She counted 193 snails across the marked zones on Saturday. She counted 47 at noon on Monday. She did not show Ray the numbers that evening. One day proved nothing. She knew this the way she knew the irrigation schedule in the pruning calendar as a fundamental operating truth that required no debate. She wrote the numbers in her spreadsheet, labeled the columns, saved the file, closed the laptop. Ray asked at dinner how many rows they had covered. Claire told him 14. He nodded and reached for the salt. The following morning went better. The morning after that went better still. The ducks were learning the lane not because they were following instructions, but because the lane contained things worth finding, which was a different kind of motivation, entirely more reliable than training, more consistent than routine. They moved through the wet grass with their bills angled down, working the soil edges, pushing through the low cover along the trellis base, turning up snails with the unhurried efficiency of creatures who were not doing a job so much as living their nature in a place that happened to align with the farm's needs. Ray began appearing at the field edge without explanation. The first time was Tuesday, briefly on his way to check the north fence line. The second time was Thursday, for longer. By the following week, he was arriving at the same time each morning and staying for the first 40 minutes of the deployment, standing at the tractor path with a thermos, watching in the particular silence of a man processing something he has not yet decided how to name. On the 8th day, he asked Claire if they were finding anything up near the old Pinot block on the upper slope. She told him she hadn't pushed them that far yet, the rotation was still building in the lower lanes, but that the data from the comparable lower rows suggested the pressure would be lower up top if they maintained the current schedule. Ray was quiet for a moment, then he asked what the feed consumption looked like relative to what she had projected. Claire pulled out this notebook she kept in her jacket and read him the numbers. Ray listened without looking at the notebook. He was watching Captain work the soil near the third trellis post. The 12th morning, when the clouds came back lower than they had been all week, Ray looked at the sky and said more to himself than to Claire, "If this keeps building, we're going to see real pressure by the weekend." Claire said she thought so too. Ray said nothing else, but he stayed at the field edge for an hour that morning, which was the longest he had stayed. What neither of them said across those 12 days was that the thing happening in the lower block was no longer entirely about pest control. Something else was occurring, slower than the snail counts, less measurable than the leaf damage percentages, more difficult to record in a spreadsheet. Ray was watching his daughter work. Not work in the abstract, not work as a concept he could evaluate from a distance, but work in the specific physical daily sense, the 5:30 mornings, the muddy knees, the patient correction of 11 ducks who had collectively decided that the third bend was optional. The notebook she pulled out in the rain to write numbers that she could have written later in the dry warmth of the kitchen, but chose to write immediately because immediate data was more reliable than memory. He recognized what he was watching. He had just not seen it in this person before. The rain that arrived the following Thursday was different. It came in the evening, the sky darkening 2 hours earlier than usual, and by 10 it had settled into the kind of sustained, serious rainfall that the valley sees 3 or 4 times a season. Not violent, not dramatic, simply committed. The gauge on the barn showed half an inch by midnight. By Friday morning, it showed 1.25 inches. The vineyard rows between the blocks had gone from wet soil to standing water in the low sections. The grass was matted flat. Every fence post on the property had a small runoff channel cutting through the soil at its base. Ray checked the voicemail on the barn line at 6 Friday morning. Dex Whitmore had called at 11 the previous night. Dex Whitmore was 65 years old, had been farming the property adjacent to the Callaway land since before Claire was born, had helped Ray pull a tractor out of a drainage ditch in 1998 without either of them ever mentioning it again, and was the kind of neighbor whose presence in the valley Ray would have described, if pressed, as part of the basic operating conditions of his life. Dex's message was brief. He had sprayed twice in the past 8 days, lost significant new growth on his upper block regardless. He was out of slug bait, completely out, not almost out, and was wondering if Ray had any to spare because Burl Hennessy's store was apparently running low, and he didn't want to wait on a reorder. Ray stood in the barn with the phone in his hand. He looked out through the barn door at the lower block where the mobile shelter sat at the field edge, and at the lane markers Claire had run in straight lines through the rows, and at the absence of any spray equipment on the Callaway property because they had not needed to move any this season. He had nothing to give Dex, Not because he was withholding because he had not needed to buy any. He called Dex back and said so. There was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds, the kind of silence that carries more information than words usually do. Dex said something about trying the supply house in McMinnville and ended the call. Ray set the phone down on the barn shelf and stood there for a minute longer than he needed to. He had been farming next to Dex Whitmore for 40 years. He had borrowed equipment from Dex. He had lent equipment to Dex. There was an informal ledger between them that neither kept written record of because it didn't need to be written, because it was the kind of accounting that sustains rural communities rather than legal contracts. He had never in 40 years been unable to help when Dex called. He had nothing to give because Claire's system had made it so he did not need what Dex needed. That was not an abstraction. That was not a data point in a spreadsheet. That was Dex Whitmore's voice on a voicemail at 11 at night and the empty space on Ray's barn shelf where the bait would have been in any other March. Ray pulled on his jacket and went to find Claire. She was already at the shelter checking the fencing connections in the rain, her hood up mud past her ankles in the low lane. Ray stopped beside her. He looked at the sky, which offered nothing useful. "Then you running them today?" Claire looked at the rain. "It's pretty wet." Ray looked out at the vineyard rows, at the standing water in the low spots, at the matted grass, at the gray shapes of the vine trunks disappearing into the mist toward the upper slope. Then he looked at the shelter and at the 80 ducks inside it who were making the particular sound ducks make when they are ready to work. "They're ducks," he said. The words came out the way certain things come out when a person has been thinking them for longer than they realized, not a declaration, not a revelation, just a fact that had shifted from one category to another inside him. He meant it the way it sounds when something that was a concern becomes an advantage. Claire opened the shelter at 6:40. What happened next was not what Ray had expected, though he would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what he had expected. The ducks entered the lower block lane and immediately lowered their heads. Not in the disorganized way of the first days, the scattered investigation of unfamiliar terrain. In the purposeful way of animals who knew where they were, knew what was here, had already learned through 11 days of work that this specific soil at the specific depth along these specific trellis spaces contained what they were looking for. The rain did not bother them. The standing water in the low sections did not slow them. Captain moved to the front of the formation and set a pace that the others matched, and the group worked through the first lane in half the time it had taken on the best day of the previous week. Ray stood under the overhang of the equipment shed roof and watched. He watched them work the third lane. He watched them find the section along the eastern trellis where the soil stayed wettest longest, where the snail pressure historically peaked, where Claire had flagged the highest pre-deployment counts. He watched them slow there and work it carefully, 6 or 7 of them at once, bills moving through the saturated grass with the patient efficiency of a process that had been refined over millions of years to do exactly this in exactly these conditions. He walked out into the rain. He did not put his hood up. He walked along the outside of the lane, fencing to the eastern section, reached over the top rail, lifted a snail from the trunk of the nearest vine, a large one, the kind that could do real damage to a young shoot in a single feeding, and tossed it over the fence into the lane. A duck that was not captain but was working close to the fence line moved to the snail before it settled into the grass. The movement was instantaneous, unhesitating, the move of an animal that has not learned to do this but simply does it the way breathing is done without deliberation. Ray stood in the rain and looked at the empty spot on the vine trunk where the snail had been. The rain came down on his jacket and his hat, and the backs of his hands, which were 63 years old, which had done 40 years of work on this ground, which had applied more bags of slug bait to these rows than he had ever kept count of. The words came low, not for Claire, not for anyone in particular. "Well, I'll be damned." He stood in the rain for another few minutes. Then he walked back to the equipment shed, picked up his thermos, poured what was left of the coffee into the cap, drank it, and went to look at the north irrigation valve that had been running slightly off pressure since February. Claire had watched him from across the lane. She did not say anything. She went back to monitoring the third lane deployment and writing in her notebook, because what she had just witnessed was not something that needed to be named at this particular moment. It needed to be, let alone the way certain things do. The naming could come later. The moment itself was enough. That night, Ray sat in the kitchen after Donna had gone to bed. He did not turn on the television. He did not go to the equipment shed. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water he was not drinking. In the spreadsheet Claire had printed that afternoon and set on the counter without comment, not handed to him, not presented. Just set there in the way that information is left for someone who needs to come to it on their own terms. The numbers on that page told a story Ray already knew from walking the rows himself, but seeing it printed made it precise in a different way. Leaf damage in the duck-managed lanes, 7% of sampled new growth showing feeding marks. Leaf damage in the control section, the 2 rows at the north edge of the lower block that Claire had left unmanaged as a comparison, 26%. The previous March, in a comparable rain event with comparable temperature conditions, the entire lower block had needed 2 emergency spray applications and had still shown measurable growth loss across the shoot tips. The labor cost of those applications, the equipment, fuel, the product, cost the time. Ray could reconstruct those numbers without looking them up, because they lived in him the way seasons live in farmers, as physical memory rather than recorded data. This March, in worse sustained rainfall than last year, with higher early season snail counts than they had recorded in 5 years, no spray, no tractor, no emergency calls to the supply house, no overtime. 80 ducks, 2 people, a white bucket, a movable fence, a system built before the crisis arrived. Ray sat with that for a long time. He thought about Dex Whitmore, who had sprayed twice and still lost significant growth. He thought about Burl Hennessy's shelves going low. He thought about a folder he had read twice in the dark with a flashlight and still taken 11 days to act on. He thought about Earl, who had read 4 pages of a different folder and said no with the quiet authority of a man who considered the matter settled, and how Ray had taken that no and turned it into his own operating philosophy without ever fully examining where it had come from. He was not angry at Earl. He had not been angry at Earl in a long time. Earl had farmed through conditions that would have broken most people, and the certainty that Ray had inherited from him had kept this land alive through its own version of those conditions. The no that Earl had given Ray in 1986 had come from a real place. It had not been wrong so much as it had been final. And finality, Ray now understood, was the thing that had done the most damage, not the decision itself, but the closing of the question, the sense that the matter was over, that trying was no longer on the table. He had been that finality for Claire. Not for 11 days in February, for years before she ever set the blue folder on his table. He had been the voice she had calibrated all her preparation against, the patient data, heavy, carefully constructed argument she had built, not to convince a stranger, but to get past a man she already knew. A man she loved, a man who had told her in 100 ways over the years that new ideas required proof he had not yet seen. She had come home with the proof pre-assembled. She had done it that way on purpose. Ray set the spreadsheet back on the counter in the same position it had been because it was Claire's document on Claire's project in a space she had made for it, and he did not want to move it from where she had placed it. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. The rain continued through the weekend. By Sunday, farms across the valley were showing the kind of damage that made the regional agricultural newsletter the following month. One operation 3 miles north lost nearly an acre of new tip growth across its most vulnerable block. Another reported having to delay a planned expansion because the spring growth they had budgeted for propagation material was compromised. Burl Hennessy's reorder arrived Tuesday, and he had sold more than half of it by Thursday. At the Callaway farm, the lower block came through the rain week looking better than it had looked in March for the past 6 years. Not untouched, the unmanaged comparison rows showed the damage the season was capable of delivering, gave it form, made it visible by contrast. But the duck-managed lanes held. The new growth was not perfect. It was not a demonstration or a brochure. It was honestly and accurately a set of vines that had come through a hard week in better shape than the same vines had come through easier weeks before. That differential between the managed lanes and the unmanaged comparison, between this March and last March, between the Callaway lower block and Dex Whitmore's upper section, was not a story Ray needed Claire to tell him. He had watched it happen. He had walked it in the rain. He had stood at the fence rail with a snail in his hand and understood something that no number in a spreadsheet would have landed with the same weight, because the spreadsheet told him the outcome, and that Friday morning in the rain had shown him the mechanism, showed him what it actually looked like when a living system absorbed a crisis that a chemical system had to chase. What he did after reading that spreadsheet was go to the equipment shed and spend 90 minutes building a ramp. The mobile shelter had a threshold lip that the ducks had to navigate every morning and evening, a 3-inch drop from the interior floor to the ground level that most of them handled without issue, but that created a bottleneck at high traffic moments when the flock was moving quickly in or out. Ray had noticed this on the third day of deployment and filed it without comment. Now he took a piece of exterior plywood from the scrap pile, cut it to width on the table saw, beveled the leading edge at 15 degrees, reinforced the underside with 2 cross pieces of 2x4, coated the surface with the non-slip deck treatment he used on the barn steps in winter, screwed a pair of aluminum L brackets to the shelter frame so the ramp could be removed and stored during transport. He left it leaning against the shelter door before he went to bed. Claire found it at 5:30 the next morning. She stood looking at it for a moment, then fitted it to the shelter frame, confirmed it seated correctly on the brackets, opened the door. The ducks came out faster than they had all season. Neither of them mentioned the ramp at breakfast. It was Donna who finally said something not about the ramp specifically, but about the pattern it represented, the accumulation of small unremarked contributions that had been building since February. She waited until Ray was outside and said to Claire with the directness she reserved for conversations that mattered, "He's been in this longer than he's admitted. You know that." Claire said she did. Donna said, "Don't make him say it before he's ready. He'll get there." Then she went back to the receipts she had been sorting, which was Donna's way of closing a subject she considered complete. The fourth night of that expanded week, with the rain finally easing to something intermittent, the sky showing the first gray-blue gaps it had shown in 10 days, something happened that Claire had not planned for. She heard it at 2 in the morning. Not duck settling. Something else, a burst of sharp alarm, 3 seconds of it, cutting through the wet silence. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, pulling on boots and jacket in the dark, not taking time for a flashlight, because the barn had motion sensor lights that would kick on when she got close. She reached the packing shed at 2:15. The motion lights came on. She saw the hinge side panel of the lane fencing pulled away from its post, a gap at ground level 18 inches wide. She saw 2 ducks at the far edge of the yard, moving in the distressed, directionless way that prey animals move when something has frightened them. She found 3 more in the shelter, huddled against the back wall. She found, as the inventory became clear, that 3 were gone. She sat down in the mud outside the shelter, not from exhaustion, from the specific weight of a moment when something you have built sustains a loss you could not prevent. The rain came down on her jacket in the intermittent way it had been coming all week, light enough to feel like consideration rather than commitment. She sat there for a while. She heard boots in the gravel. Ray came around the corner of the packing shed in his heavy jacket, with a large industrial flashlight from the equipment shed in his hand, the one he used when he needed to see clearly in the dark, not the small one from the kitchen drawer. He had been awake. He had heard the same sound she had heard. He looked at the gap in the fencing. He looked at the 2 ducks at the far edge of the yard, still moving in agitated circles. He looked at Claire in the mud. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he handed her the flashlight and walked to the gap in the fencing. What Claire understood, watching him work, he had wire cutters in his jacket pocket, which meant he had assessed the situation and brought the right tool before seeing it. Because that was how he moved through problems, was that Ray Calloway in this moment was not running an experiment. He was not evaluating a system. He was fixing what had been broken on land he had farmed for 40 years, which was the same thing he had always done, applied now to a fence protecting ducks that he had not wanted in a lane that had not existed 6 months ago, running through a block of vines that was performing better than it had in half a decade. He was not choosing to believe in the system. He was already inside it. He worked the fencing for 2 hours. Not the gap, only the entire perimeter of the deployment zone. Every post, every connector, every section of wire where the tension had shifted under the rain and the ground movement. The motion lights cycled off twice, and he reset them both times without pausing. Claire got up from the mud and worked the opposite side, checking tension, resetting connectors, replacing 2 sections of wire that had stretched beyond usefulness. They finished at 4:15. The fencing was better than it had been before the breach. Materially better, not just repaired, reinforced the corners, braced the post spacing, corrected in 3 sections where it had been slightly too wide. Ray collected the wire cutters and the extra clips in his jacket pocket. He looked at the shelter where the remaining ducks had settled. He looked at Claire. "Get some sleep," he said. He walked back to the house. Claire stayed in the barn for a few more minutes, not because there was more to do, but because she needed to let the adrenaline finish its work. Then she went in, changed into dry clothes, lay down, did not sleep for an hour, then slept through her alarm for the first time since February. Ray was already at the shelter with the morning water refill when she came out at 7. The week after the rain broke, the valley looked the way it always does when a long, wet stretch finally lifts exhausted, wrung out the fields, carrying the evidence of what they had absorbed in the dark, waterlogged soil, the bent grass, the debris lines along the fence rows where runoff had moved and settled. The sky went blue on Thursday, genuinely blue, not the pale provisional blue of a gap between systems, but the deep, steady blue that means the pressure has shifted and the change is real. Farmers across the county came out of their houses and walked their land with the particular expression of people taking inventory after something they couldn't control has finished with them. The damage assessments moved through the community the way they always do, by phone, by the farm supply counter, by the slow accumulation of conversations in feed store parking lots, where men who don't easily discuss losses find ways to discuss losses by talking about logistics instead. Marv Elstrom had lost measurable tip growth across his upper north block. Dale Pruitt, in only his second season managing his uncle's property, had made the decision to spray late and paid for the timing in a way that would affect his canopy density through July. Dex Whitmore had held his losses to a level he described as manageable, which was Dex's way of saying it hurt, but not fatally a vocabulary of restraint that Ray recognized because he had used it himself in bad years. The Callaway lower block came through it the way Claire's data had projected, which was to say better than it had any right to given the sustained pressure of that week. The managed lanes held at 7% leaf damage on sampled new growth. The comparison rows at the north edge showed 23%. The gap between those two numbers was not a theory anymore. It was standing in the ground, visible to anyone who walked the block, measurable by anyone who took the time to count. Claire took the time to count. She spent the Thursday after the rain clearing walking every flag sample point in the lower block, updating the spreadsheet with the post-event numbers. She did it methodically, without urgency, the way she did everything that was important, not fast, not slow, but with the specific pace of someone who understands that accuracy is more valuable than speed. Ray serviced the irrigation pump that morning because it needed doing, and because standing at the tractor path watching his daughter count leaves was not something he was ready to name out loud yet. By Friday afternoon, Claire had the full post-event analysis printed and set on the kitchen counter in the same unhanded way she had been leaving information for Ray throughout March available, without being pushed, present without demanding engagement. Cost of setup, $1,900 in February. Emergency spray cost this March $0. Emergency spray cost the previous March, in a less severe rain event, $460 plus labor. Growth loss comparative, significant in favor of the managed system. Egg production from the flock had begun the previous week, not a revenue center, not a profit driver, but a secondary return that reduced the net cost of the operation in a way worth recording, honestly. The call from the county extension office came the following Monday. It was not Burl who called. It was a woman named Sandra Holt, the county extension agent, who had gotten Claire's name from 3 different sources in the span of 5 days. 2 vineyard owners who had heard about the Callaway lower block through the post-rain conversations in parking lots. One of Burl's regular customers, who had asked Burl directly what was going on at the Callaway place, and Burl himself, which surprised Claire more than the others had. Sandra Holt was efficient and specific, which Claire appreciated. She explained that the monthly small farms meeting was coming up in 3 weeks, that she had been looking for a presenter on integrated approaches to spring pest management, and that the Callaway situation had come to her attention with enough frequency that she wanted to give it a formal platform. She asked if Claire could do 10 minutes. Claire said she could do 10 minutes, that she would bring data. Sandra said to bring pictures too. Claire said she would bring both. She spent the 2 weeks before the meeting the way she spent everything, with preparation that looked from the outside like calm, but was actually the result of extremely organized focus. She built the slides carefully, not to persuade, but to document. She chose the numbers that were honest over the numbers that were flattering, which in this case happened to be the same numbers, but the distinction mattered to her. She included the bad first day. She included the 3 ducks lost to the coyote. She included the labor hours for the first week, which were significantly higher than the system's steady-state labor requirement, because the learning curve was real and needed to be represented honestly if the presentation was going to be worth anything to anyone actually thinking about trying this. Ray knew about the meeting. She had told him at dinner 2 weeks prior, mentioned it without ceremony. He had nodded. She had not asked him to come because asking would have introduced a pressure that the situation did not need. She arranged for a neighbor's teenager to help with the morning deployment on the meeting day so she could leave by 6:30. She loaded the truck the night before. The morning of the meeting, Ray came into the kitchen at 5:15 with his jacket already on. Donna was making coffee. Ray looked at the green rain jacket Claire had laid out by the door the night before and said he could probably help with the projector setup if she needed it. Claire said that would be useful. Ray said he would drive himself, that she should go ahead when she was ready. He said it the way people say things they have decided after a long time of deciding quickly. So the decision does not have the opportunity to become uncertain. The meeting was held in the County Extension Office's main meeting room, a functional space with folding chairs, a projector screen that had a slight lean to the left, bad overhead lighting, a coffee station with a carafe that had been on the burner since mid-morning, and the specific acoustic quality of rooms built for utility rather than residence. 36 people came in, more than the usual attendance, which Sandra Holt had projected based on the number of calls she had fielded in the 2 weeks since she sent out the meeting notice. Ray came in after most of the chairs were filled. He took a seat in the back row, end position, which was the same position he chose at every community meeting he had ever attended, because the back row gave a man the ability to see the full room without being part of it. Claire stood at the front in her work clothes, the green jacket, barn boots, jeans that had been washed since the rain week, but still carried the faint watermark line at the knee where the mud had been. She had not changed into something more presentable because there was nothing more presentable to change into, in the sense that what she was presenting was not a person, but a system. And the system had happened in barn boots in the mud, and the audience in this room understood that. She did not oversell it. That was the first thing Ray noticed from the back row before anything else. She opened with the cost, not with the success, not with the after numbers, but with the cost and the setup and the first day's chaos. Because the first thing a room of farmers needs to hear is that the person at the front has not simplified the problem. She described the 11 ducks who went wrong at the first bend. She described the 5 minutes Captain spent fighting a reflective fence post. People in the room laughed at that, the genuine laugh of recognition, not of condescension. Then she showed the numbers. The room changed when the numbers went on the screen. Not dramatically, farmers don't change dramatically in public, but perceptibly in the way a room changes, when people stop waiting to hear the part that won't work and start listening for the part that might. The comparative leaf damage figures, the pre- and post-deployment snail counts, the zero emergency spray cost against the previous year's $460. The feed cost per week, the egg return, the net operating cost of the system. Real numbers, clean columns, no rounding in the favorable direction. A man named Wallace Pruitt. No relation to Dale, a vineyard owner Ray had known for 20 years, a man whose natural resting expression suggested permanent mild skepticism, raised his hand before Sandra called for questions. He was the kind of man whose first instinct was to find the load-bearing assumption in any argument. He did not do this to be difficult. He did it because it was the correct way to evaluate information. And he had been doing it long enough that people in the room took his questions seriously. 1 block, Wallace said, his tone not unfriendly but precise. 1 season, 1 farm. Why should any of us believe this scales beyond what you've described here? The room waited. Claire took a breath. She was about to answer, had the answer prepared, had thought through this specific objection during the 2 weeks of preparation, when something happened at the back of the room. Ray Calloway stood up. He did it the way he did everything that mattered, without announcement, without performance, with the specific deliberateness of a man who has made up his mind and is now executing the decision. He was 63 years old. He had been farming this valley since 1984. He had not planned to speak. He had come to carry the projector. The room turned to look at him, because a room always turns when someone in the back row stands, especially someone who has been sitting in the back row in specific silence for the entire presentation, especially someone whose name most of the people present had known for decades. Ray's voice when it came was the voice he used when he was not performing anything low deliberate with the particular weight of words that have been carried for a while before being set down. I told her it was a bad idea, he said. I told her she was wasting my money and my rows. A pause, not for effect, because the next sentence required it. I was wrong. The room held very still. I've been farming this valley since 1984, Ray continued. 40 years. If that counts for anything, and I'm aware it might not, then let me tell you what 40 years in this valley looks like when it's wrong. It looks like me standing in a farm supply store in February telling my daughter that ducks aren't a pest management plan. Another pause. The lower block came through the worst snail week we've had in 5 years with 7% leaf damage. I have 40 years of marches to compare that to. That number is not a coincidence. He sat back down. He did it with the same deliberateness as the standing, and then he was simply in the back row again, looking at the front of the room the way he had been looking at it since the meeting started. Claire stood at the front of the room with a specific expression that Ray had not seen on her face before. Not triumph, not relief, not the vindication of someone who has been waiting to be proven right. It was something quieter and more complicated than any of those things, and it took him a moment to identify it. She looked like someone who had just been handed something they had needed for a long time without knowing how to ask for it. The questions that followed were different from the questions before Ray spoke. Before they had been evaluative, the questions of people weighing whether to take something seriously. After they were operational. An orchardist named Faye Drummond asked about using ducks in fallen fruit cycles for late-season pest management. A vegetable grower asked about predator-proofing specifications for portable fencing. Wallace Pruitt, the same man who had asked the skeptical question, asked how Claire had handled the rotation schedule for the Pinot block given its different drainage characteristics, which was the question of someone already thinking about how to adapt the system to his own land rather than whether to consider it. Burl Hennessy was in the back corner, which Ray noticed when he scanned the room after sitting down. Burl had not announced his presence. He had come in after the chairs filled, taken a standing position near the door, the posture of someone who wanted the option of leaving quietly. When Claire's slide with the comparative damage numbers had gone up, Burl had stopped watching the screen and started watching the room instead, which was what a man does when he needs to understand how other people are receiving information before he decides how to receive it himself. After the formal session ended, the room broke into the standing conversations that are the actual purpose of meetings like this. Ray stopped briefly to speak with Dex Whitmore, who had come in late and taken a standing position at the side wall. Dex said something brief and direct, the kind of thing men who have known each other for 40 years can say without much preamble. Ray nodded. Burl Hennessy found Claire near the coffee station. He was holding a cup he had not drunk from. He looked at her with the expression of a man doing arithmetic on something and nearly at the sum. How many ducks per acre? He asked. It was the first substantively technical question he had asked her in any context which both of them understood. Claire told him the answer depended on the pest pressure, the terrain, the rotation schedule. She said she would not start with a number. She would start with a test section, establish the baseline counts, run the flock for 3 weeks, measure the differential. The number followed from the data rather than the other way around. Burl listened with his arms slightly uncrossed from where they had been. He said he might want to stock more poultry netting in the spring order. Claire said that seemed reasonable. 6 farms signed up to visit the Callaway operation before the month was out. 3 of them came on a Tuesday in early May when the morning was clear and the lower block was running its 5th rotation of the season. Faye Drummond was there, the orchardist who had driven down from her operation north of Carlton and brought a notebook. Wallace Pruitt came alone and walked the lanes without saying much for the first 20 minutes, watching the flock work, occasionally crouching to look at the soil at trellis base level. A younger vineyard manager named Theo Bascom, who had taken over a leased property the previous year, came with a list of written questions he worked through systematically with Claire while the others walked. Ray was present for part of the morning. He did not present anything. He answered a direct question from Wallace about the fencing. Hardware specifications, walked with Faye to the comparison rows to show her the differential up close, helped Theo locate the irrigation layout map in the barn when Theo asked about it. He moved through the morning the way he moved through all his farm mornings, purposefully, without announcement, doing the next useful thing. The following week, Claire went back to Burl Hennessy's store for the fencing material she needed to extend the system into the South Pinot block. Burl was at the counter when she came in. Two of his regular customers were at the coffee station. Burl looked up when the door opened. "How's the petting zoo?" he said. It came out with the old phrasing, but a different weight behind it. Not the dismissal of February, but something closer to a greeting that had stayed past its usefulness. A habit of language the speaker knew had expired, but hadn't yet found the replacement for. Claire set her list on the counter. While Burl was pulling the order, she opened her folder and laid the postseason summary on the counter between them. She did not explain it. She smoothed it flat and left it there, the way you leave something for a person who will pick it up when they're ready. Burl looked at it while he was writing up the order. He was quiet for longer than the order required. The two customers at the coffee station had drifted closer in the way people drift when something is happening nearby that has their attention, even if they're pretending it doesn't. Burl set his pen down. He looked at the damage comparison column, then looked at Claire. "I drove past your place every morning during the rain week," he said. His voice had the quality of a man being accurate rather than generous. "Counted the rows myself." One of the men at the coffee station put his cup down. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure what I was counting. Now I know what I was counting." Claire took the summary back and put it in the folder. She paid for the fencing order. She thanked Burl not effusively in the way of people who accept acknowledgement without requiring it to be larger than it is. She loaded the materials into the truck. On the drive home, she thought about February, about the farm supply store and the roll of netting over her shoulder, and the laughter at the coffee station, and the quiet drive home after the deliberate choice not to argue, because some arguments can only be answered by the season rather than by words. She thought about the 12 pages her father had written in 1986 and where they had ended up. She thought about the things that get put in boxes and stay there. The storage corner of the old packing shed was where Claire found it on the second Saturday of May, when she and Ray were clearing space for the expanded shelter configuration that the South Pinot Block addition would require. They were moving boxes that had accumulated in the corner over years: irrigation parts, old gate hardware, a broken wheelbarrow that Ray had been keeping in case the frame turned out to be useful for something which it had not. Claire moved the boxes systematically, checking contents before stacking them outside. The box was not labeled. It was a standard banker's box with a lid that had warped slightly from years of variable humidity, the cardboard soft at the edges but structurally intact. Claire lifted the lid because that was what she was doing with all the boxes. Inside was a rubber band around a manila folder. The rubber band crumbled when she touched it. The folder was dated 1986 in blue ink on the front tab in the handwriting of someone younger than her father, someone who had not yet developed the slightly more compressed script of Ray's current hand. She opened it. 12 pages, diagrams of irrigation layout with proposed modifications marked in pencil, cost projections in columns, a reference list of agricultural publications from the early 80s, the sources a 25-year-old had found and read and cited in a formal proposal he had built for a man who read 4 pages of it before saying no. The last page was blank except for one line written in the same younger blue ink at the top. Sometimes the right idea just needs the right person at the right time. Claire stood in the storage corner of the packing shed with the folder in her hands for a while. She was not crying. She was doing something quieter than that, something that didn't have a name she would have chosen to use. She was understanding with a specific clarity that comes from holding physical evidence. The full length of what her father had carried from 1986 to the kitchen table in February of 2024. The gap between the man who wrote that sentence and the man who had spent 4 decades becoming the voice that had been used against him. She carried the box into the house. She set it on the kitchen table. She left it there without opening it further, without adding anything to it, without staging the moment in any way. She went back to the packing shed to continue the inventory. Donna found the box first, which was not entirely accidental. Donna came into the kitchen for her afternoon coffee at 3:15 and saw the box on the table and understood immediately not the specific contents, but the category of things she was looking at, the kind of found object that changes the temperature of a room. She opened the folder. She read the last page. She put the folder back. She sat at the table with her coffee for a long time. When Ray came in from the south irrigation check at 4:30, Donna was still at the table. The box was in the center. Ray saw it when he was still in the doorway. He came to the table slowly with the particular slowness of someone who recognizes an object from a great distance before arriving at it. He sat down. He lifted the folder out. He held it without opening it for a moment, looking at his own handwriting from 38 years ago on the tab. Claire came in from the packing shed at 5, still in her barn jacket, a smear of dirt on her forearm from where she had been moving boxes. She saw Ray at the table with the folder. She went to the sink and washed her hands. She dried them. She came to the table and sat down across from him in the same chair she had sat in when she set the blue folder on this table in February. Ray had the folder open to the last page. He looked at the sentence he had written at 25 after the meeting with Earl before he put it in the box. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, and Claire let him because she had learned this year that Ray Calloway processed important things at the pace they required and not the pace that anyone else's comfort suggested. When he finally looked up, his eyes were the eyes of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive. Not broken, not the dramatic arrival of someone whose defenses have collapsed. The quiet arrival of someone who has walked a long way and can see from where he now stands the full shape of the terrain he crossed. "I should have let you try sooner," he said. "Not the ducks, not the lower block, not the system." The sentence was about a time before the blue folder, before the kitchen table in February, before the 11 days of thinking. It was about a pattern that had been running longer than either of them had named out loud, and he was naming it now precisely in 4 words. Claire did not say you were right or it's okay or any of the things that would have made the moment smaller than it was. She sat with it. She let it be the size it actually was, which was significant, without being dramatic true, without requiring ceremony. Donna got up quietly and refilled her coffee and went to the living room, because she understood that this particular conversation was complete. That evening, Ray went to the equipment shed. He pulled the lumber he had been eyeing for 2 weeks, good exterior pine, the kind that holds up to repeated weather exposure, and spent 3 hours building a proper gate for the duck lane entrance at the lower block. Not a temporary gate, not a repurposed piece of stock fencing. A real gate with a latch that operated cleanly, hinges mounted correctly, so the swing was level dimensions measured to the lane width rather than approximate. He finished it at 9, carried it out to the lower block, hung it on the post he had already set, opened it closed. It confirmed the latch, seated without force. He stood in the dark with his hand on the gate for a moment. The valley was quiet, the way it gets quiet in May when the rain has finally stopped, meaning business, and the nights are cold but not punishing. The vines in the lower block were visible in the ambient light, the new growth that had come through March and April intact, the shoots hardening now into something more substantial, the leaves catching what little light the sky offered and holding it briefly before releasing it. Ray walked back to the house. The following spring, 5 farms in the county ran waterfowl rotations. Not a revolution, not a movement. 5 farms each, starting with a test section, each building the system from the data outward rather than from the conviction inward. Faye Drummond ran 25 ducks in a section of her orchard during the late season cleanup cycle. Wallace Pruitt tried 40 birds in his most vulnerable block, the one that faced north and held moisture longest. Theo Bascom, the young manager on the leased property, ran a small mixed flock and sent Claire a text message in April with a photo of his leaf damage comparison that showed numbers she recognized. At the Calloway farm, the flock expanded to 120. Claire divided the lower section into 5 rotating lanes, a configuration that gave each lane a recovery period between deployments, which improved both the pest management effectiveness and the soil condition in the lanes over time. The duck manure distributed across the rotation added a modest but measurable contribution to the soil biology in the managed sections. Not a replacement for the fertility program, but a return, a small addition from an animal already earning its place in the system through the work it did before this secondary benefit was even considered. Ray built the expanded shelter over 2 weekends in February using plans he had sketched himself, incorporating modifications from the first season's observations. He built it with better wheel placement so it could be positioned more precisely in the lane configuration. He added a covered water station on the south side. He did not announce any of this as a change of position. He announced it by building the shelter. One morning in late April of that second season, Claire was running the flock through the third-lane rotation when Sandra Holt called to ask if Claire would present at the Regional Sustainable Agriculture Conference in Salem in June. Not 10 minutes a full session, 30 minutes plus questions with a formal write-up for the conference proceedings afterward. A researcher from Oregon State had heard about the Callaway operation from two separate sources and had left Sandra a voicemail asking whether the data was available for discussion as part of a potential field study. A vineyard manager from California who had attended the county meeting the previous May had called to follow up on a question he had not heard answered to his satisfaction. Claire said yes to the conference. She drove to Salem on a Thursday in June in the farm truck with a folder of documentation that was thicker than the original blue folder by a factor of 3, because a year and a half of careful records builds differently than a senior project, and because the question she had been asked to answer in Salem was not whether the system could work, but how it worked and under what conditions, and with what variables and what failure modes, which were the questions that came after the first question had been settled. The conference room held 120 people. Claire stood at the front of it the way she had stood at the front of the county extension office meeting room the previous May, in work clothes with data without performance. She told the story plainly. She started from the first laugh at Burl Hennessy's counter because that was where it started, and because the first laugh was important, because the first laugh was the moment that required everything that came after. She told them about the bad first week, about the 11 ducks who couldn't find the lane, about the 3 lost to a coyote on a Wednesday night in the rain, about the 2 hours of fence work at 2 in the morning by a man who had spent 11 days deciding whether to let the experiment happen at all. She did not name Ray in that particular detail, but she said, "I came home with a folder full of data and a system I believed in." The hardest part of the year was not the coyote, not the rain, not the ducks, who thought the traffic cones were optional. The hardest part was understanding that being right is not enough. You still have to build the fence, fill the water, count the damage, bring the ducks home at night. She let that sit for a moment. And sometimes the most important thing that happens is not the data you collect, but the person who stands up in the back of a room and says they were wrong. A researcher in the third row wrote something down. The drive home from Salem took 2 hours. Claire came through the valley as the light dropped behind the western hills, the sky going from pale gold to the particular deep blue that comes before dark in Oregon in June. The kind of sky that makes the green of the valley below it look more saturated than it actually is. She drove past Dex Whitmore's property where she could see from the road that his lower block was running a flock. She could tell by the shelter position, the lane markers, the way the lower rows had that slightly more worked-over look that managed sections develop over a season. She pulled into the Callaway driveway at 8:15. The barn lights were on. Ray was in the barn rinsing the water tubs from the evening deployment, working through the stack of them with the same methodical pace he brought to all maintenance tasks, the pace of someone for whom the doing is not separate from the caring. He heard the truck. He did not stop rinsing. "How'd it go?" he called. Claire came into the barn. She took off her jacket, hung it on the hook inside the door. "Fine," she said. Ray rinsed the last tub, set it inverted on the rack. "They listen." Claire considered this. "Some of them." Ray dried his hands on the shop towel on the workbench. He nodded once. "That's how it starts," he said. He went back to cleaning up. Claire stayed in the barn for a few minutes, not because there was anything more to do, but because the barn in the evening in June, with the valley going dark outside the open door, was not a bad place to be at the end of a long day. Captain was making the specific sound he made when the flock had been brought in well and the water was fresh and everything was where it should be, a low, self-satisfied murmur. Slightly too loud, slightly too confident. The voice of a creature who had decided that the day had gone according to plan. The ducks went out again the next morning. Ray was 63 years old. He had a bad right knee, a mostly good back, a 39-year marriage, a daughter who had come home with a folder full of ideas, 120 ducks who knew their route, and a gate he had built himself out of good exterior pine with a latch that seated clean. He stood at the entrance to the lower block with the second bucket, the one that had appeared in the barn one April morning without explanation and become part of the daily sequence while Claire opened the gate she had not asked him to build. The ducks came out into the lane the way they came out every morning, with the urgency of creatures for whom the work is not a job, but a nature. heads already angling down before the first trellis post, bills already reading the soil for what it held. Captain moved to the front of the formation, ranged ahead the way he always did, looped back at the first bend to confirm the others were following, then pushed forward into the lane. The valley was quiet in the early morning, the light still low, the air carrying the cool of the night, the vines in the lower block dark green. The new shoots hardened into something that could take what the season had left to offer. Ray looked at the lane where the flock was working at 40 years of marches that had looked different from this one, at the gate hanging level on its hinges, at the rows that had come through the worst week of the season, cleaner than they had come through easier weeks before. He said it quietly to no one in particular, or to a duck, or to the particular kind of morning that only arrives when a long argument has finally been settled the right way. "Get to work, Captain." Claire heard it. She did not turn around. She shook the bucket. The flock moved deeper into the lane. The morning opened over the valley the way Oregon mornings do in spring, slowly, with patience, with the specific quality of light that belongs to places where the rain has made everything more alive than it meant to be. It was enough. It was in the way that the important things usually are more than enough.